Alright, so I'm at the gas station yesterday filling up my tank, just trying to get through my weekly errands, and I've got ESPN radio playing in the car because that's what I always have on. First take comes on, and normally I might just let it play in the background while I'm pumping gas and checking my phone, but then I hear Stephen A. Smith start talking about the Los Angeles Rams and their offensive coordinator search. And I'm like, okay, let me actually pay attention to this, because the Rams have been all over the news with Michael LaFleur leaving to become the Cardinals' head coach. So I really focus on what I'm hearing while I'm standing there at the pump. And there's Stephen A. on the show with Mad Dog Russo and Molly Karam, and you can tell from the energy in their voices that they're about to have a deep discussion about the Rams' future. Hey, what's up, everyone? Before we dive into everything I have for you today, I need to share something real with you that would mean the absolute world to me. That subscribe button right there. Hitting it right now would bring me one step closer to my dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers. I know you're eager to get into all this content, but real quick, just smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. It's such a simple thing. It takes literally 1 second, but it's honestly the biggest way you can support this journey and help me reach that milestone. Trust me, every single subscription gets me closer to that goal. And honestly, it would mean everything to me. So, do me that quick favor right now and be part of this dream becoming reality. Stephen A. opens the segment by talking about how the Rams are in an interesting position after Michael LaFleur left to take the Cardinals' job. He's going on about how this is becoming a pattern for the Rams. They keep losing offensive coordinators to head coaching jobs because Sean McVay's coaching tree is so successful. Stephen A. mentions Kevin O'Connell, who became the Vikings head coach, and Zach Taylor, who's the Bengals head coach, and now LaFleur going to Arizona. It's a revolving door at the OC position. But Stephen A. says the one thing that isn't changing is Sean McVay is still going to be the play caller. None of these offensive coordinators actually called plays in LA. McVay does all of that himself. Mad Dog is nodding along and he says, yeah, the offensive coordinator role in LA is more about game planning and helping McVay with schemes rather than actually calling plays on game day. Then Stephen A. starts talking about potential candidates to replace LaFleur. He mentions Jake Peetz, who's currently Seattle's passing game coordinator and who actually spent time with the Rams from 2022 to 2023 as an offensive assistant. Stephen A. says Peetz has a really close relationship with Cooper Kupp, which was part of why the Seahawks were able to trade for Kupp, and he's been really successful in Seattle, helping Sam Darnold have a career resurgence this season. He talks about how Peetz has 11 years of NFL coaching experience across multiple teams, and he'd be a familiar face coming back to LA. Mad Dog says that makes sense. Bringing back someone who knows the system and has a relationship with the players could provide continuity during the transition. Molly jumps in at this point and asks if Peetz is actually going to be available. Stephen A. says, that's the big question, because Seattle just lost Clint Kubiak, who left to become the Raiders' head coach. So they're looking for an offensive coordinator too, and Peetz is probably going to get promoted internally rather than leaving for a lateral move to LA. Mad Dog says, yeah, if you're Peetz and you have a chance to be the actual play-calling OC in Seattle versus being McVay's assistant in LA, you'd probably stay in Seattle. But then Stephen A. pivots to something that really caught my attention and made me actually stop looking at my phone. He says, but you know what? Maybe instead of just focusing on who the next offensive coordinator is going to be, the Rams should also be thinking about adding offensive weapons to keep their offense elite. And that's when Stephen A. drops a name I absolutely wasn't expecting. He says, according to sources he's been talking to around the league, one name that's come up in Rams discussions as a potential offensive weapon they could target is Brian Thomas Jr. from the Jacksonville Jaguars. When I hear this, I'm like, wait, what? Brian Thomas Jr. to the Rams? That would be a huge addition to an already loaded offense. Stephen A. starts breaking down why this could make sense, and honestly, the more he talks about it, the more I'm like, okay, I can actually see the logic here. He says, look, the Rams just had the #1 offense in the NFL last season. Matthew Stafford is about to win MVP, but you can never have too many weapons, especially in today's NFL. Stephen A. says Brian Thomas Jr. is a 6'3" receiver with elite speed who runs like a 4.3 40. He had a solid rookie season in Jacksonville, showing he can be a true #1 receiver. And if the Jaguars are willing to move him as part of their rebuild, the Rams should absolutely be interested. He talks about how Thomas could give the Rams another vertical threat to pair with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, creating a three-headed monster that would be impossible to defend. Mad Dog immediately pushes back on this. He's like Stephen A. The Rams already have elite receivers. Why would they trade valuable assets for another one when they could use those assets to improve their defense, which is their actual weakness? Stephen A. doesn't back down at all. He comes right back and says, Mad Dog, you can never have too many weapons. Look at what happened when Kupp and Nacua both got hurt earlier in the season. The Rams' offense struggled. Having depth at receiver is crucial, especially in the playoffs. Molly asks what the actual trade would look like. Stephen A. says it would probably take a second-round pick, plus maybe a mid-round pick, or a young player on defense. He says Brian Thomas Jr. is still on his rookie contract, which means he's cheap and controllable for several years. So the Jaguars would want decent value, but it wouldn't require a first-round pick. Mad Dog says, okay, but why would the Jaguars trade a first-round pick after just one season? That makes no sense unless they're completely blowing up their roster. Stephen A. says, but that's exactly what they're doing. Jacksonville is a disaster. They went 3-14, they just fired their coach, and they might be starting over from scratch. The conversation shifts to talking about how Brian Thomas Jr. would actually fit with the Rams' offense. Stephen A. gets really detailed about this, talking about how Sean McVay's offense is predicated on creating mismatches and getting playmakers the ball in space. He says, imagine having Cooper Kupp running routes from the slot, Puka Nacua on one side, and Brian Thomas Jr. on the other side. Defenses would have no idea who to double-team. Stephen A. also talks about how Thomas has elite vertical speed, which would force safeties to play deep, which would open up the underneath passing game and the run game for Kyren Williams. Mad Dog says that sounds great in theory, but the Rams' biggest problem last year was defense, not offense. They gave up like 35 points in the playoff loss to the Eagles, so maybe they should focus on that side of the ball. Stephen A. fires back and says, but if you can score 40 points every game, because your offense is that loaded, you don't need an elite defense, you just need a defense that's good enough. He talks about how the Kansas City Chiefs have won multiple Super Bowls without having the best defense in the league. They just have Patrick Mahomes and enough weapons to outscore everybody. Mad Dog says, yeah, but the Chiefs also have a really good offensive line, and the Rams' O-line is kind of shaky. So maybe they should focus on that before adding more receiver. They spend some time discussing the internal candidates for offensive coordinator. Stephen A. mentions Nate Scheelhaase, who's the current passing game coordinator and who everyone seems to love. He talks about how Puka Nacua gave this quote about Scheelhaase being a modern coach who understands the younger players and can communicate effectively using slang terms that resonate with them. Stephen A. says Scheelhaase would provide continuity, since he's already been working with Matthew Stafford and knows the system, and promoting from within might be the best move. Mad Dog agrees and says, yeah, when you had the #1 offense in the league, you don't want to make massive changes, you want to keep things relatively stable. Molly brings up Dave Ragone, who's the quarterback's coach, and who has previous offensive coordinator experience with the Falcons. She asks if he might be a candidate. Stephen A. says absolutely. Ragone has been coaching Matthew Stafford for the last 2 years, and he actually called plays before in Atlanta, so he has that experience. He says Ragone would be another internal option that makes sense, though he personally thinks Scheelhaase is probably the front-runner. Mad Dog says the Falcons' offense wasn't great under Ragone, so that might count against him, but his relationship with Stafford could be the deciding factor. The conversation continued, and they start talking about Alex Tanney, who's the Colts passing game coordinator. Stephen A. mentions that Tanney helped with Daniel Jones's resurgence in Indianapolis this season, but he has some concerns about Tanney's track record in Philadelphia, where Jalen Hurts actually got worse under his coaching before improving after Tanney left. He says it's hard to know how much credit to give Tanney for Jones's success when the Colts also had one of the best run games in the league with Jonathan Taylor. Mad Dog says yeah, and the Rams don't have a Jonathan Taylor to lean on, so maybe Tanney wouldn't be as effective in LA. They also discuss whether the Rams should go external or internal with the hire. Stephen A. gets really passionate about this, talking about how when you have the #1 offense in the NFL, you don't want to bring in someone from outside who might want to implement major changes. He says continuity is key. You want someone who already knows the system and can keep things running smoothly. Mad Dog says that makes sense, but you also don't want to be afraid of bringing in fresh ideas. Sometimes an outsider perspective can take a good offense and make it even better. Molly asks them to talk about what Matthew Stafford thinks about all of this. Stephen A. says Stafford is about to win MVP. He's playing at an elite level, and the last thing you want to do is mess with his chemistry and rhythm by bringing in a coordinator who wants to change things. He says whoever the next OC is needs to be someone Stafford is comfortable with and trusts, and that's probably going to be either Sheilhase or Ragone, since Stafford has worked with both of them closely. Mad Dog says, yeah, quarterback comfort is huge. You can't underestimate the importance of that relationship. The conversation shifts back to talking about Brian Thomas Jr. and why the Rams would want him. Stephen A. talks about how having a young receiver with upside gives the Rams flexibility for the future, because Stafford isn't going to play forever, and when they eventually transition to a new quarterback, having elite weapons already in place makes that transition easier. He says Thomas is only 22 or 23 years old. He's still on a rookie contract, and he could be a cornerstone of the Rams' offense for the next decade. Mad Dog says, but you're talking about thinking long-term when the Rams are clearly in win-now mode with Stafford, so maybe they should focus on immediate need rather than future planning. Stephen A. also talks about how competitive the NFC West is becoming. He mentions the Seahawks with Sam Darnold are going to be good. The Cardinals with Kyler Murray are improving, and the 49ers are always a threat when they're healthy. He says if the Rams want to stay ahead of the competition, they need to keep adding talent and not get complacent just because they had the #1 offense last year. Mad Dog says that's true, but you also have limited resources. You can't just keep adding expensive players without it affecting your salary cap. Molly brings up the fact that Cooper Kupp is getting older and has had injury issues. She asks if maybe the Rams are thinking about Brian Thomas Jr. as a potential Kupp replacement down the line. Stephen A. says that's an interesting point. Kupp is in his 30s now, and while he's still elite when healthy, the Rams need to start thinking about life after Kupp at some point. He says bringing in a young receiver like Thomas could be a way to hedge against Kupp's age and injury concern. Mad Dog says, but Kupp just had an amazing season, so it seems premature to be thinking about replacing him. Maybe they should just enjoy having him while he's still playing at a high level. They also discuss whether Jacksonville would actually trade Brian Thomas Jr. Stephen A. says the Jaguars are in complete chaos. They have a new general manager coming in. They might be trading Trevor Lawrence. They're starting completely over, so everything should be on the table. He mentions that the Jaguars have multiple receivers, including Christian Kirk and Evan Engram at tight end, so they're not desperate to keep Thomas if they can get good value for him. Mad Dog says, but Thomas showed real potential as a rookie. He had like 700 yards and multiple touchdowns, so trading him after 1 year would signal that Jacksonville is in full tank mode. Molly tries to get them to make predictions about whether this could actually happen. Stephen A. says he thinks there's maybe a 25% chance the Rams actually pursue Brian Thomas Jr. It's definitely a long shot, but it's not impossible given how aggressive Sean McVay and Les Snead have been historically with trades. Mad Dog says he thinks it's even less likely, maybe 10 or 15%, because the Rams are more likely to focus on defense, and the Jaguars probably aren't going to trade a rookie first-rounder unless they're getting a massive overpay. The segment starts winding down, and they both kind of summarize their position. Stephen A. says the Rams should promote Nate Sheilhase to offensive coordinator for continuity, but they should also explore adding Brian Thomas Jr. to give their offense even more weapons and create a dynasty-level receiving core that could dominate for years. Mad Dog says he agrees Sheilhase is probably the right hire internally, but he thinks trading for Thomas is unnecessary when the Rams already have elite receivers and should focus their resources on improving the defense. Molly thanks them both, and the show goes to commercial. I'm standing there at the gas pump finishing up and just trying to process everything I heard. Brian Thomas Jr. to the Rams would be absolutely wild and would create arguably the best receiving core in the entire NFL. On one hand, I can see Stephen A.'s point that you can never have too many weapons, and having Kupp, Nakua, and Thomas would be an embarrassment of riches that would make the Rams' offense absolutely impossible to stop. Thomas is young, he's cheap because he's on a rookie contract, and he's shown he can be a #1 receiver, so adding him would give the Rams incredible depth and insurance against injury. But on the other hand, I can also see Mad Dog's point that the Rams' real weakness is on defense, where they got torched in the playoffs, and using valuable draft picks and resources to add another receiver when you already have elite weapons seems like a misallocation of asset. Whether anything actually happens or not remains to be seen, but one thing is clear: the Rams are in a really good position with the #1 offense in the league, and whatever moves they make this offseason need to be smart and strategic to keep them competitive in a tough NFC West division.